I'm here at Hemi today for a couple of reasons, but mainly to talk about whether or not it's a useful place to come when thinking about possible leads in trying to trace the DNA of Will Adams. This topic of Will Adams' DNA is one I have become behooven to address given the nature of the topic I've chosen to cover, but I've been prompted to get a move on and address it more quickly from some very intelligent and thought-provoking posts that I've found in my YouTube comment section. So while it would be a good idea for me to go into the topic of DNA in a little more detail, it's also worthwhile to say why the use of DNA in the search for Will Adams is useful or even desirable. It's useful because there are 3 different types of DNA search, all of which can be of some use. Let's look at those 3 types of DNA test in more detail. Mitochondrial DNA is transmitted through the mother only, although it can be found in offspring of both sexes. The advantages of mitochondrial searches are that it's able to trace ancestry back through a female line for thousands of years. In fact, it was used to trace human ancestry, the beginnings of humanity itself, back to East Africa. The disadvantages, though, are that Joseph and Susanna Adams, William's children in Hemi, would have inherited their mother's DNA, but not their father William's, so a mitochondrial DNA check is of no use in trying to find the descendants, if they exist, of Susanna and Joseph here in Hemi. But how it could be used is to identify whether or not the human remains, the northwest European human remains found at Hirado, are those of Will Adams. Because records say with certainty that Will Adams had at least one brother and one sister whose baptisms were registered in the parish church at Gillingham. And the descent can be traced through William's sister if her female descendants and any living descendants of that line exist. The famous King Richard III of England was identified after remains were found using the same method, tracing a direct line down from his sister. The second type, Y chromosome DNA testing, can be traced from father to son. It's transmitted only through the male line though. The advantages to this test are that it could identify the grave remains at Hirado if a direct male descendant from an unbroken line of male descent from Will Adams can be found, whether in Japan, the UK or elsewhere. Disadvantages to this line of testing, though, are that the test cannot be taken by females and is reliant on an unbroken male line of descent. And that brings us to the third type of DNA testing, autosomal. Autosomal DNA testing is able to trace ethnic ancestry back, regardless of whether it's through fathers or mothers, back hundreds of years to the times of Will Adams and beyond. It can identify Northwest European ancestry among other ethnicities and could be administered among the Hemi population to identify or discount surviving traces of Northwestern European ancestry, thus informing the next steps in the research. 4. If no trace of Northwest European ancestry is found in minute traces in the local Hemi population, there is no point in continuing the DNA search for Will Adams here, and energies and minds can be focused elsewhere. Disadvantages to autosomal DNA testing, though, are that it doesn't specify Asian ethnicity. It's just a very general, you are of Asian ancestry type of identification. doesn't tell you whether you're Chinese, Japanese, Korean or whatever. And it isn't useful for identifying individual ancestors. But it can be used to find potential descendants in Hemi. Potential descendants only, but at least would give the indication of whether or not the investigation is worth continuing here. And so, to summarise, at first I was keen to emphasise the utility of autosomal DNA tests, given that any living Japanese descendant of Will Adams in the Hemi area would likely show their ethnic ancestry in an autosomal test. As I was correctly reminded though, that alone wouldn't prove descent from Adams, just a likelihood, but it would be a firm lead, which could be investigated further. What I didn't at first realise was the potential use of mitochondrial DNA testing, given the success of the identifying of Richard III through his sister's mitochondrial line, and the fact that Adams had a sister. A long shot for sure, but it's good to know that theoretically it has potential. And of course, if an all-male line of descent from Adams can be found using Y chromosome testing, not only would it identify the remains at Hirado, but would confirm conclusively whether Adams has living descendants, whether in the UK, Japan or elsewhere.